As a review, in a previous segment we discussed the enumerated powers of the federal government listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There are also some powers delegated to the federal government scattered throughout the rest of the Constitution, such as the power to manage federal property and territories, provide for a census, consent to the admission of new states, propose amendments, and others. If you look at the list of all the granted federal powers in Article 1, Section 8, and elsewhere, the general theme is to grant the national government those powers the founders thought were needed at the national level and could not or should not be done by the states. The most prominent being national defense. Most of what the federal government makes legislation on today is not on the list and is therefore unconstitutional. So how do they get away with it? I've already discussed the abuse of the General Welfare Clause. The next most abused clause is called the Commerce Clause, which gives the Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. As usual, the growth of the federal government in this area was gradual. Starting in the Progressive era with a law against monopolies in 1890, federal intrusion into areas of commerce then gradually increased in the early 1900s and then exploded in the FDR New Deal era, where the government sought control of the economy through wages and price controls, production quotas, and other top-down schemes to, quote, stimulate the economy. The courts initially rejected some of these progressive laws, but when Roosevelt threatened to pack the Supreme Court in a second inaugural address, one of the judges caved and switched his voting philosophy. Have you ever heard the phrase, "a switch in time saved 9"? That was in reference to the switch vote on the Supreme Court. In 1942, in the case of Wickard versus Philman, the court helped the rogue president and Congress with their socialist agenda and greatly expanded the Commerce Clause. The case was about an Ohio farmer who challenged the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which had been ruled unconstitutional earlier, but had been repassed with some changes. The farmer, Roscoe Philman, had grown more than his allotted amount of wheat per that act, which gave wheat quotas to farmers, meaning they could only grow so many acres of wheat as dictated by the Department of Agriculture. The farmer argued against the Department of Agriculture's authority to make quotas for wheat that was only grown for his own consumption. In other words, to feed his livestock. He argued that since the wheat was not crossing state lines, the government could not regulate it under the Commerce Clause. The court sided with the government, stating that even wheat grown for the farmer's own consumption had an impact on interstate commerce and could be regulated because it could have been sold across state lines. The court said the commerce power is not confined in its exercise to the regulation of commerce among the states. It extends to those activities intrastate which so affect interstate commerce, as to make regulation of them appropriate means to the attainment of a legitimate end. So as long as there is a legitimate end in the mind of Congress, it's allowed. Of course, this is a very broad definition. Anything and everything can now be regulated by the federal government because everything has a potential to affect interstate commerce. Is that the way it was meant to be? What did the founders mean when they gave the power to regulate interstate commerce? Surprisingly, there was very little discussion about that power in the Constitutional Convention or in the ratification conventions. because the phrase to regulate commerce had a common understanding to mean the regulation of imports and exports between countries or states, mainly through tariffs. In other words, a tax on goods imported and or exported. Madison in Federalist number 42 stated, "A very material object of this power was the relief of the states which import and export through other states from the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Were these at liberty to regulate the trade between state and state, it must be foreseen that ways would be found out to load the articles of import and export during the passage through their jurisdiction with duties which would fall on the makers of the latter and the consumers of the former. The obvious reason for that power was to prevent one state from imposing tariffs or other taxes from goods traveling through its borders, which was a common practice under the Articles of Confederation and was a major source of friction between the states. In other words, Congress was given the power to prevent trade wars between the states. Very little else was discussed. To say that more than that was intended by the founders can be easily refuted. Here are some of the reasons. If the current interpretation was intended by the ratifiers, it would make the enumeration of other congressional powers irrelevant, as we've discussed before. The Anti-Federalists would have made a big deal out of this unlimited power, and the Constitution would never have been approved. There is direct evidence against today's interpretation. During the ratification debates, advocates of the Constitution publicly listed examples of powers not authorized to the national government. Among the activities listed that were the exclusive sphere of the states were manufacturing, which included labor relations, other business enterprises, agriculture and other land use, land titles and conveyances, property outside of interstate trade, commerce wholly within state lines, marriage, divorce, and other aspects of domestic regulations, regulation of most crimes and civil suits, social services, training the militia, religion, and education. All of those things we're doing now, or the federal government is doing now, which they shouldn't. Joseph Story, again in his commentaries on the Constitution, echoed the views of the founders when discussing the Commerce Clause. The question comes to this: whether a power exclusively for the regulation of commerce is a power for the regulation of manufacturers. The statement of such a question would seem to involve its own answer. Can a power granted for one purpose be transferred to another? If it can, where is the limitation in the Constitution? Are not commerce and manufacturers as distinct as commerce and agriculture? If they are, how can a power to regulate one arise from a power to regulate the other? It is true that commerce and manufacturers are, or may be, intimately connected with each other. A regulation of one may injuriously or beneficially affect the other, but that is not the point in controversy. It is whether Congress has a right to regulate that which is not committed to it under a power which is committed to it simply because there is or may be an intimate connection between the powers. If this were admitted, the enumeration of the powers of Congress would be wholly unnecessary and nugatory. Agriculture, colonies, capital, machinery, the wages of labor, the profits of stock, the rents of land, the punctual performance of contracts, and the diffusion of knowledge would all be within the scope of the power, for all of them bear an intimate relation to commerce. The result would be that the powers of Congress would embrace the widest extent of legislative function, to the utter demolition of all constitutional boundaries between the state and national governments. The power to regulate manufacturers, not having been confided to Congress, they have no more right to act upon it than they have to interfere with the systems of education, the poor law, or the road laws of the states. It is notorious that in the convention, an attempt was made to introduce into the Constitution a power to encourage manufacturers, but it was withheld. Congress is empowered to lay taxes for revenue, it is true, but there is no power to encourage, protect, or meddle with manufacturers. Again, we see that the current interpretation of the Constitution is radically different from the founders' intent. The federal government has used the Commerce Clause and other clauses to expand control to almost every aspect of society, like minimum wage laws, OSHA laws and regulations, and energy production restrictions, all limiting our freedom to do our own businesses as we think best. We the people have been ignorant of or complacent about the true meaning of our Constitution and have allowed the federal government to grossly overstep its bounds. The only way to gain back our freedoms is to demand that our congressmen stay within the bounds of the original intent of the Constitution.